Southeastern Minnesota, summer of 1940. While every farmer in the county built standard frame houses with single-layer siding, Lars Nilsson was wrapping his family's log cabin inside what looked like a machine shed. His neighbors called it wasteful. They said he was building a barn around a house that was already too small. The shed measured 26 by 32 feet with 12-foot walls, creating a 5-foot buffer of dead air around his 14 by 24-foot cabin. He spent $90 and 10 long days with his sons framing what everyone dismissed as the most foolish waste of lumber they'd ever seen. Then November 11th arrived. The Armistice Day blizzard hit without warning, temperatures plunging from the 60s to below zero in less than 24 hours. Wind shrieking at 50 miles per hour, snow piling 20 feet deep in drifts. Standard farmhouses saw indoor temperatures drop to the 30s, even with stoves roaring. Pipes froze and burst. Families huddled in kitchens, burning through half a cord of wood in a single night just to survive. But inside that foolish shed, something different happened. The cabin stayed at 54 degrees while the buffer zone held steady at 30, 20 degrees warmer than direct exposure to the storm. What did this Norwegian farmer understand about wind, dead air, and thermal envelopes that his neighbors had dismissed as primitive nonsense? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. The log cabin that would become the center of southeastern Minnesota's most mocked construction project had already survived 45 winters by the time Lars Nilsson decided it needed help. Built around 1895 by his Norwegian immigrant father Ole, the structure measured 14 by 24 feet, with walls of unhewn softwood logs averaging 8 inches thick. Ole had hewn the interior surfaces smooth and chinked every gap with limestone blocks and home-burned mortar, following techniques carried from the old country where winter temperatures routinely dropped 40 degrees below zero. The cabin's usable heated space totaled just 336 square feet on the main floor, plus a cramped loft reached by a ladder nailed to the wall. Through 4 decades of Minnesota winters, one cast-iron cook stove rated at roughly 25,000 BTU per hour provided the only heat source for the entire structure. Lars remembered childhood nights waking to find 1 or 2 inches of snow on his quilts, where it had sifted through the shake roof and poorly battened board ceiling. Even with the walls chinked tight, wind would find ways through, carrying cold air that made the small space feel like a cave with a fire at one end and an ice house at the other. The brutal winters of 1935 through 1937 had convinced Lars that something fundamental needed to change. He calculated that he was burning 4 to 5 cords of oak and elm each season just to keep the cabin barely livable, with indoor temperatures often dropping into the 40s during the worst cold snaps. His neighbors burned similar amounts in their larger frame houses, but they had furnaces and multiple stoves, better windows, and rooms they could simply abandon when fuel ran low. What bothered Lars most was the waste he could see but not stop. Heat leaked through every log joint, despite the chinking. The single-pane windows bled warmth like open doors. Wind hitting the west wall at 30 or 40 miles per hour would drive cold air through cracks that seemed perfectly sealed on calm days. He had watched his father fight the same battles year after year, adding more chinking, burning more wood, accepting that a frontier cabin simply could not be truly warm in a Minnesota winter. But Lars had also been watching how other structures handled the wind. The machine sheds and barns on neighboring farms stayed noticeably warmer inside than the outdoor temperature, even without heat sources, simply because their larger volumes and enclosed air stayed still. Dense spruce and pine windbreaks planted west of farmhouses could cut heating fuel use by 10 to 40% just by reducing wind speed around the buildings. He remembered stories from George Whitefeather, an Ojibwe man who worked seasonal jobs on area farms, about winter lodges built with double layers of bark and cattail mats, creating dead air spaces that acted as insulation even in temperatures that froze rivers solid. The county extension office had published pamphlets praising multi-row windbreaks around farmsteads, explaining how even a simple row of trees could create a zone of calmer air that extended downwind for distances equal to 10 times the tree height. But trees took decades to grow, and Lars needed a solution that winter. During the summer of 1940, he laid out what would become the most ridiculed building project in the township's history. The design was brutally simple: a stripped-down pole barn that would completely surround the existing cabin, creating a continuous buffer of still air between the old log walls and the Minnesota wind. The outer structure measured 26 by 32 feet, giving 5 feet of walking space on all sides of the cabin. 6 by 6 posts at 8 feet on center were buried 3 to 4 feet in the ground with tamped stone for stability. The wall height reached 12 feet to clear the cabin's ridge and provide circulation space above. Rafters cut from locally milled 2x6s spanned the structure on 24-inch centers, supporting a roof of rough boards and split shingles. The walls received the cheapest possible treatment: 1x12 rough boards with 1x3 battens covering the joints. No insulation, no building paper, just a basic weather shell to keep out rain and snow. The entire structure was designed to stop wind while allowing some air movement, creating what amounted to a giant unheated room with the cabin sitting in the middle like furniture. Lars scavenged some lumber from old buildings and bought the rest from the local sawmill, keeping his out-of-pocket cost to about $90 in 1940 money. With help from his 2 teenage sons, they set posts and framed the shed over 10 12-hour days in July and August, working in the kind of heat that made the coming winter seem like a distant threat. The project attracted attention from the moment the first posts went into the ground. Neighbors driving past on the gravel road would slow down to stare at what looked like a barn being built around a house. The local feed store became headquarters for speculation about Lars Nielsen's mysterious construction project. Some guessed he was planning to add rooms to the cabin and needed the shed for storage. Others figured he was building a workshop and would move the cabin later. By August, when the roof went on and the walls were boarded up, the truth became unavoidable. Lars had built what looked like a machine shed with a small log cabin parked inside it. The mockery began immediately and spread through the township like news of a barn fire. Harold Peterson, whose farm sat half a mile north, told anyone who would listen that Lars was building a barn for a house that's already too small. At the grain elevator, men joked that if Lars built one more roof over that thing, he'd never see daylight again. The feed store man started calling it Nilsen's nesting dollhouse, and the name stuck through the fall harvest season. The social cost mounted quickly. Anna Nilsen worried that their family was becoming a laughingstock at church gatherings. Their hired hand quit for what he called a normal place down the road, claiming he couldn't work for someone who didn't know the difference between a house and a barn. Even Lars's own sons wondered if their father had lost his mind during the long summer heat. By September, the project was complete. A continuous 5-foot walkway around the cabin, stacked with 2 full cords of split wood under the protection of the shed roof. 3 cheap thermometers hung at eye level on posts and walls, one outside on the weather, one in the shed, one inside the cabin. To anyone passing by, it looked like the most expensive way imaginable to store firewood and confuse the neighbors. But as October's first frost arrived and heating season approached, Lars Nilsen was about to prove that sometimes the most mocked ideas are the ones that save lives when the weather stops caring about anyone's opinion. The first week of November 1940 brought weather that made Minnesota farmers forget about winter preparation. Daytime temperatures climbed into the 60s across much of the state, with some areas seeing readings that belonged in early October rather than the traditional start of heating season. Hunters headed into the woods wearing light jackets, leaving heavy coats at home. Many families delayed their final winterizing tasks, figuring they had weeks before serious cold would arrive. Harold Peterson and his neighbors had followed the standard preparation routine that had served Minnesota farmers for decades. Their frame farmhouses featured single-layer board siding, with maybe a skim coat of hardboard on the interior, relying on caulk and storm windows to seal against drafts. Most had planted tree rows on the west sides of their properties, but the saplings were still years away from providing meaningful wind protection. Firewood supplies sat at around 3 cords of mixed hardwood, enough for a normal winter with room to cut more if needed. The Weather Bureau had issued warnings about a sharp cold front approaching from the northwest, mentioning possible snow and dropping temperatures. But the language seemed routine. the kind of forecast that came every November without causing much concern. Radio announcers mentioned the front in passing, focusing more on hunting conditions and crop prices than any potential for severe weather. What the forecasters could not adequately communicate was the scale of atmospheric violence brewing over the northern plains. A massive dome of Arctic air, dense and bitter cold, was racing southward at unprecedented speed. Meanwhile, warm, moisture-laden air from the Gulf of Mexico continued flowing northward, setting up a collision that would create one of the most violent weather events in Minnesota's recorded history. Wind chill, though not yet an official measurement in 1940, represented a critical factor that most farmers understood only through experience. When air temperature dropped to 5 below zero and wind speeds reached 20 miles per hour, exposed skin would freeze as if the temperature were 30 below. The same principle applied to buildings. Wind hitting exterior walls would pump cold air into every crack and accelerate heat loss through both conduction and air infiltration at rates that could overwhelm even large heating systems. Studies of farmstead windbreaks had shown that properly designed tree rows could cut wind speed by significant percentages and reduce home heating fuel needs by 25% or more. But these benefits required mature plantings with dense branching close to the ground, conditions that few Minnesota farms possessed in 1940. The morning of November 11th began with temperatures in the 40s and 50s across much of Minnesota, accompanied by light rain that turned roads muddy but passable. Hunters and farmers went about their normal routines, planning weekend activities that assumed the mild weather would continue for several more days. By mid-afternoon, the first signs of change appeared as winds began shifting from the south to the northwest, carrying the scent of snow and the sharp bite of truly cold air. Temperatures started dropping rapidly, falling 10 degrees in the first hour, as the Arctic front carved through the warm air mass like a blade through butter. What happened next would enter meteorological history as one of the most dramatic temperature collapses ever recorded in the upper Midwest. Across Minnesota, temperatures plunged 30 to 50 degrees in less than 24 hours, with some locations experiencing drops that seemed to defy natural limits. The Twin Cities saw readings fall from the 50s to below zero before midnight, while northern counties recorded temperature crashes that left observers questioning their instruments. Wind speeds climbed steadily through the evening hours, reaching sustained velocities of 40 to 50 miles per hour, with gusts approaching 60. Snow began falling as the temperature dropped, but this was not the gentle accumulation of a typical Minnesota storm. Wind-driven snow created horizontal sheets of white that reduced visibility to zero and built drifts with supernatural speed. By midnight on November 11th, conditions had deteriorated into something beyond the experience of most residents. Snow depths reached 16 inches in the Twin Cities and climbed to 27 inches near Collegeville, but the real danger came from wind-sculpted drifts that grew to heights of 10, 15, and 20 feet in open country. Roads disappeared completely, and power lines began snapping under the combined assault of wind and ice. The Armistice Day blizzard was creating a natural experiment that would test every assumption about winter shelter in Minnesota. Frame farmhouses with their single-layer siding and minimal wind protection faced conditions that pushed heating systems beyond their design limits. Indoor temperatures that normally held steady in the 60s began dropping toward the 50s, then the 40s, as wind-driven cold found every weakness in the building envelope. At the Peterson farm, Harold found himself feeding split oak into his parlor stove at a rate that consumed half a rick of wood in 6 hours just to maintain 50 degrees in the kitchen. Unheated bedrooms dropped into the 30s despite closed doors and quilts hung over doorways. Wind hitting the west wall drove cold air through cracks that had never leaked before, creating drafts strong enough to flutter curtains and make candle flames dance. Similar scenes played out across southeastern Minnesota as the storm reached its full fury. Families gathered in kitchens around cookstoves, abandoning the rest of their houses to the cold. Some lost windows to wind pressure, tacking up quilts and boards in desperate attempts to maintain any barrier against the Arctic air. Pipes froze and burst in crawl spaces where wind blew directly under floors, flooding basements with water that would turn to ice before morning. The Nielsen farm, with its ridiculous shed wrapped around a too small cabin, was about to provide the most unexpected demonstration of thermal engineering principles that southeastern Minnesota had ever witnessed. As the blizzard reached peak intensity and neighbors struggled to keep their families alive in houses that suddenly seemed as fragile as paper bags, Lars's envelope of still air was quietly performing exactly as frontier builders and indigenous lodge makers had understood for generations. Sometimes the best way to fight the wind is not to fight it at all, but to step aside and let it howl around a space it cannot touch. As the Armistice Day blizzard reached its full fury, Lars Nielsen moved between his three thermometers with the methodical precision of a scientist conducting an experiment. Outside, where wind screamed across open fields at 50 miles per hour, the mercury had dropped from 12 degrees at dusk to 0 by midnight, then continued falling toward 5 below as the storm's center passed overhead. Inside the shed's buffer zone, the second thermometer told a different story entirely. 26 degrees at midnight, climbing to 30 degrees by 2 in the morning, then holding steady despite the Arctic chaos just beyond the board walls. The cabin's interior thermometer recorded the most remarkable readings of all. Starting the evening at a modest 60 degrees with the cook stove burning at its normal rate, the temperature had dropped only to 54 degrees by the storm's worst hour, then stabilized at 52 degrees as Lars banked the fire for the night. The mathematical difference was undeniable. The cabin was running 20 to 22 degrees warmer than it would have been without the shed's protection, achieved with less fuel than he had burned during ordinary cold snaps. Anna Nielsen kept careful notes in a composition book, recording temperatures and wood consumption every 2 hours through the night. The cook stove consumed roughly 1/8 of a cord during the 12-hour period from dusk to dawn, maintaining habitable conditions throughout the structure's 336 square feet plus loft. Under normal circumstances, a night this cold would have required twice that amount of fuel just to keep the cabin above 40 degrees. The physics behind the envelope's performance became clear through direct observation rather than complex calculations. Wind that would normally hammer the cabin's log walls at 50 miles per hour now encountered the shed's outer boards instead, spending its energy against lumber that could be replaced cheaply rather than against the irreplaceable chinking between logs. Once the wind broke against the outer shell, it had nowhere to go except around and over the structure, leaving the 5-foot buffer zone in almost perfect stillness. This dead air space functioned as a massive, uninsulated wall cavity, similar to the gaps between studs in modern construction, but scaled up to surround the entire living space. Cold air in the buffer zone was still cold, hovering just below freezing, but it moved so slowly that convective heat loss from the cabin walls decreased dramatically. The temperature differential between inside and outside air, normally the driving force behind heat loss, had been cut by more than half, simply by eliminating wind speed around the heated structure. The envelope also created an unexpected heat recovery system. Warmth that leaked through the cabin's log walls and single-pane windows did not escape immediately into the sub-zero night. Instead, it accumulated in the buffer zone, raising the temperature of the air that surrounded the cabin by several degrees above what it would have been in direct exposure to the storm. Heat that escaped the cabin warmed the shed air, which in turn reduced the temperature difference that drove further heat loss through conduction. Stored firewood in the walkway acted as thermal mass, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it slowly through the night. 2 full cords of split oak and elm, representing roughly 64 cubic feet of dense hardwood, provided a reservoir of thermal stability that moderated temperature swings in the buffer zone. Tools, lumber, and other materials stored in the shed contributed additional thermal mass, creating a system that responded slowly to outside temperature changes rather than tracking them minute by minute. The envelope's performance during the blizzard validated principles that indigenous builders had understood for generations. Ojibwe winter lodges used double layers of bark or canvas with cattail mat insulation, creating dead air spaces that could maintain interior temperatures 20 to 30 degrees above outside readings even without continuous fires. Plains tribes built earth lodges with thick sod walls that used thermal mass and protected air spaces to stay comfortable when surface temperatures dropped far below 0. Norwegian Stabur storehouses employed similar concepts on a smaller scale, using tight log construction and strategic placement to maintain above freezing conditions for food storage throughout winters that routinely reached 40 below. These structures survived for centuries not through brute force heating, but by understanding how still air, thermal mass, and wind protection could work together to create microclimates that defied the surrounding weather. What Lars had accomplished with his ridiculed shed was a scaled-up version of these time-tested principles, applied with modern lumber and post-frame construction techniques. The continuous 5-foot air gap around the cabin created the largest dead air space most neighbors had ever seen, while the shed's 12-foot ceiling height allowed for air circulation that prevented moisture buildup without destroying the thermal benefits of stillness. Comparison with neighboring farmhouses revealed the envelope's true effectiveness. Harold Peterson's single-story frame house, located half a mile away with similar western exposure, recorded indoor temperatures as low as 34 degrees in unheated bedrooms, despite burning half a cord of mixed hardwood in a single night. His kitchen, heated by both a cook stove and a parlor stove, barely maintained 50 degrees at the storm's peak. Another neighbor's barn, a traditional post and beam structure with board and batten siding, provided an instructive contrast. Large doors on the east side blew in during the storm's worst hour, allowing wind to howl directly through the structure and creating conditions nearly as harsh as the open field. Livestock huddled against the lee wall, but the building provided little more shelter than a 3-sided windbreak. The Nielsen envelope, meanwhile, had converted howling wind into merely cold, still air. The shed's simple construction allowed some air exchange to prevent humidity problems, but the structural shell broke up wind patterns completely. Snow that would have driven against the cabin walls at hurricane force instead built up gently against the outer boards, creating an additional layer of insulation that further improved the system's performance. By dawn on November 12th, as the blizzard's center moved eastward and wind speeds began to drop, the envelope had demonstrated heating efficiency that bordered on the miraculous. The cabin remained fully habitable throughout the storm, using less fuel than many neighbors burned just to keep their kitchens above freezing. More importantly, the system had maintained these conditions without requiring dangerous trips to outdoor woodpiles or risky attempts to restart failed heating equipment. The envelope's success during the Armistice Day blizzard would soon transform it from the township's greatest joke into its most copied innovation. But first it would serve a more immediate purpose, keeping alive not just the family that built it, but the neighbors who had spent months mocking its construction. Dawn on November 12th revealed a landscape transformed beyond recognition. Snow drifts 10 to 20 feet high blocked every road in the township, sculpted by wind into knife-edged ridges that would take days to clear even with county plows. Power lines lay buried or snapped, leaving most farms without electricity for furnace fans, water pumps, or lighting. Telephone service had failed completely when the first poles went down, cutting off communication between isolated farmsteads scattered across miles of impassable prairie. The Nielsen farm sat in the middle of this frozen wasteland like an island of functionality. Water barrels stored in the shed had frozen solid on top, but remained liquid underneath, providing a reliable supply without trips to the outdoor well. Food stores remained accessible in the protected walkway, and the 2 cords of split wood had stayed bone dry throughout the storm. Most importantly, the envelope system continued operating exactly as designed, maintaining cabin temperatures in the low 50s with minimal fuel consumption. By mid-morning, it became clear that several neighboring families faced genuinely life-threatening situations. The Peterson farmhouse, a 2-story frame structure with balloon construction and minimal insulation, had lost a large west-facing window when wind pressure blew out the sash and glass. Harold had tacked a quilt over the opening, but Arctic air poured through the fabric, dropping indoor temperatures toward the upper 30s, despite 2 stoves burning at maximum output. The Miller family, living in a similar house 3/4 of a mile southeast, discovered frozen and burst pipes in their crawl space, where wind had blown directly under the floor through lattice venting. Without running water, and with indoor temperatures dropping steadily, they faced the prospect of abandoning rooms one by one until the entire house became uninhabitable. Frank Thompson's situation had deteriorated even further. His kitchen cook stove had run out of properly seasoned wood by midnight, forcing him to burn green elm that produced more smoke than heat. With his chimney partially blocked by ice and his fuel supply running low, carbon monoxide had begun accumulating in sealed rooms where his family huddled under every blanket they owned. By noon on the 12th, when wind speeds had dropped enough to make walking possible, the first refugees began arriving at the Nilsson farm. Harold Peterson and his wife made the 3/4-mile journey on foot, breaking trail through chest-deep snow that required nearly 2 hours to traverse. They arrived exhausted and showing early signs of hypothermia, their outer clothing crusted with ice, and their faces bearing the distinctive waxy pallor of prolonged cold exposure. The transition from the outer world to the envelope's protection provided dramatic evidence of the system's effectiveness. Stepping from wind chill conditions equivalent to 20 below zero into the shed's still air at 30 degrees felt like entering a heated building. The psychological relief was immediate and visible, shoulders relaxed, breathing deepened, and the tight expressions of people fighting for survival began to ease within minutes. Moving from the buffer zone into the cabin itself completed a thermal journey that spanned more than 50 degrees of effective temperature difference. At 52 degrees, the cabin felt genuinely warm to people who had spent 12 hours struggling to survive in houses that barely reached 40 degrees. The contrast was so stark that Harold Peterson stood motionless for several minutes, simply absorbing the sensation of air that did not hurt to breathe. By evening, 2 more families had made similar desperate journeys through the drifts. The cabin now sheltered 13 people in a space designed for 5, with adults sleeping on the floor and children sharing the loft with the original family. Under normal circumstances, such overcrowding would have strained the heating system beyond its capacity, but body heat from the additional occupants actually improved the envelope's performance. Each adult generated approximately 75 to 100 watts of heat through normal metabolism, equivalent to a bright incandescent bulb. With 8 additional adults in the cabin, the effective heating capacity increased by 600 to 800 watts, roughly equal to a small electric heater. This biological heat source allowed the Nilsson family to maintain interior temperatures between 55 and 58 degrees while actually reducing wood consumption compared to the previous night. The mathematics of survival became brutally clear through direct comparison. Neighbors reported that maintaining even minimal heating in their exposed houses required burning half a cord of wood per day, consuming their entire winter supply within a week if the cold continued. The envelope cabin, housing nearly 3 times as many people, consumed 1/3 of a cord over the same 72-hour period while providing superior comfort and safety. More importantly, the envelope eliminated the deadly risks associated with desperate heating attempts. Families trapped in failing houses often resorted to burning furniture, newspapers, or unseasoned wood that produced carbon monoxide. Others attempted to heat larger spaces by opening oven doors or using camping equipment indoors, creating fire hazards that killed more people than the cold itself. The protected walkway surrounding the cabin allowed safe access to properly seasoned firewood without exposure to life-threatening wind chill. Cooking, sanitation, and basic maintenance tasks could be performed in the buffer zone at temperatures that permitted normal dexterity and reasoning. The envelope had transformed a survival crisis into merely an uncomfortable camping experience. As the 3rd day of the crisis wore on, subtle changes began appearing in how the refugees viewed their host's construction project. Men who had joked about Nilsson's barn house now found themselves studying post spacing, rafter connections, and siding details with professional interest. When someone offered to pay for the shelter, Lars simply pointed to the woodpile and said they could help stack the next delivery. Harold Peterson, who had led the mockery at the feed store, spent considerable time examining how the shed roof had been strapped to resist uplift in 50-mile-per-hour gusts. Frank Miller asked detailed questions about post depth and concrete footings, taking mental notes for future reference. The transition from ridicule to respect happened without speeches or apologies, communicated instead through careful observation and practical questions about construction techniques. The envelope had passed its most severe test, proving that indigenous building principles, Scandinavian construction wisdom, and modern lumber could combine to create shelter that outperformed conventional housing by margins that meant the difference between life and death. But the storm's immediate aftermath would reveal an even more significant achievement: the transformation of a community's understanding of what constituted proper preparation for the frontier's most dangerous season. Roads remained impassable for 6 days after the Armistice Day blizzard finally moved eastward, leaving southeastern Minnesota isolated under drifts that required coordinated efforts from county crews and local farmers to clear. When newspapers finally reached the scattered farmsteads, residents learned they had survived one of the deadliest weather events in regional history. The storm had claimed at least 49 lives in Minnesota alone, with the total death toll across the upper Midwest reaching 154 people. Many of the fatalities occurred not in open country, but in homes and vehicles where inadequate heating and poor insulation had turned shelter into death traps. Within 20 miles of the Nielsen farm, 3 families had lost members to carbon monoxide poisoning from desperate attempts to heat sealed rooms with improvised fuel sources. 2 elderly residents had died of hypothermia in houses that never warmed above 35 degrees despite continuous fires. The stark mathematics of survival had sorted the prepared from the unprepared with brutal efficiency, and word of who had thrived versus who had barely survived spread quickly through the close-knit farming community. At the first church gathering after roads reopened, conversations that had once centered on jokes about Lars's construction project now focused on intensely practical questions. Harold Peterson, who had spent 3 days warm and safe in the envelope cabin, found himself explaining post spacing and wall heights to neighbors who had previously dismissed the shed as foolishness. Frank Miller described the transition from outdoor wind chill to the buffer zone's still air, using terms like night and day and life and death that carried weight after the community's shared brush with disaster. The technical details that had once seemed like pointless overbuilding now attracted serious study. The 6x6 posts at 8 feet on center and buried 4 feet deep had held solid against wind gusts that toppled mature trees and destroyed conventional outbuildings. The 12-foot wall height that neighbors had mocked as excessive had provided crucial air circulation space that prevented moisture buildup while maintaining thermal benefits. Even the rough board siding with batten strips, criticized as the cheapest possible construction, had proven perfectly adequate for its intended purpose of breaking wind while allowing controlled air exchange. By spring of 1941, 3 neighboring farms had begun their own envelope projects. Harold Peterson built a 30 by 40-foot machine shed that wrapped around the north and west sides of his farmhouse, creating a partial buffer zone that cut his heating fuel consumption by an estimated 25%. The structure served double duty as equipment storage and wind protection, justifying the expense through practical utility beyond its thermal benefits. Frank Miller chose a more ambitious approach, constructing a 3-sided shed at 10 feet distance from his frame house, forming a U-shaped wind barrier that protected the structure's most vulnerable exposures. His design incorporated lessons learned from the Armistice Day experience, including wider overhangs for snow protection and multiple access doors to prevent the catastrophic ventilation problems that had nearly killed his neighbor Frank Thompson. The most sophisticated adaptation came from Tom Anderson, a carpenter who had studied the Nielsen envelope with professional interest during the crisis. Anderson built a complete wraparound shed using engineered post spacing and structural connections that could resist extreme wind loads while supporting equipment storage on an upper level. His design included ventilation louvers positioned to maintain air circulation without destroying wind protection, representing a refinement of the basic envelope concept. Data from these early adopters confirmed the thermal performance that had saved lives during the blizzard. Families reported consistent reductions in winter fuel consumption, ranging from 25 to 30%, matching documented studies of wind protection and thermal envelope effectiveness. More significantly, none of the envelope-protected houses experienced frozen pipes or dangerous indoor temperature drops during subsequent cold snaps, even when outdoor readings reached 20 below zero. The envelope principle began appearing in agricultural publications and county extension materials as a proven method for reducing farmstead heating costs and improving winter habitability. Articles in practical farming magazines described the concept as a house-within-a-house approach that used dead airspace and wind protection to create thermal buffers around existing structures. The language avoided theoretical physics, focusing instead on construction details, material costs, and measured performance data that farmers could evaluate and adapt to their own situations. By the mid-1940s, variations of the envelope design had spread throughout southeastern Minnesota and into neighboring counties. Rural builders developed standardized approaches using locally available materials and conventional post-frame construction techniques. The concept proved particularly popular among Norwegian and German immigrant families, whose old country experience included similar principles applied to barns, root cellars, and food storage buildings. The thermal envelope's success paralleled developments in building science that would not reach mainstream construction for another generation. During the 1970s energy crisis, designer Lee Porter Butler introduced the EC double envelope house to American architects and builders, describing it as a revolutionary approach that used continuous air spaces between inner and outer building shells to reduce heating costs and improve comfort. Butler's designs typically featured 6 to 12-inch air gaps with controlled circulation systems, representing a sophisticated evolution of the same dead air principles that Lars Nielsen had applied with rough lumber and common sense. Technical publications from the National Research Council of Canada and University Extension Services confirmed that thermal envelope structures could maintain above-freezing indoor temperatures with minimal active heating, even during extended cold periods. The physics involved convective heat recovery, reduced temperature differentials across building envelopes, and elimination of wind-driven air infiltration that had been understood intuitively by frontier builders but required decades to quantify scientifically. The connection between indigenous building traditions, immigrant construction wisdom, and modern thermal envelope design became explicit in academic studies of vernacular architecture. Ojibwe winter lodges with their double-layer bark walls and insulated air spaces represented sophisticated applications of thermal principles that European settlers initially dismissed as primitive. Norwegian stabber buildings and other Scandinavian storage structures had employed similar concepts for centuries, creating thermal buffers that protected food supplies through Arctic conditions without mechanical heating systems. Lars Nielsen's envelope had served as a bridge between these traditional knowledge systems and 20th century construction techniques, proving that frontier innovation often meant combining old wisdom with new materials rather than inventing entirely novel solutions. The barn around a house that had drawn ridicule in the summer of 1940 became a template for energy-efficient construction that would influence building design for generations. On a landscape where weather showed no mercy for conventional thinking, the man who wrapped his cabin in a simple shed had demonstrated what indigenous lodge builders and Norwegian craftsmen had always known. When winter winds decide to kill, the difference between survival and death often comes down to understanding that the best way to fight the cold is not to fight it directly, but to step aside and let it rage around a space it cannot touch.